The Marvel Cinematic Universe, also known as the MCU, is now the most popular movie franchise in the entire world. With the imminent arrival of Phase 4 and a new era of the MCU, we as fans have so many questions and speculations about the story of the next chapter. Today, we are extremely honored to be joined by a professor from the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, Professor Carnes, who is also a Marvel expert. Professor Carnes, if you want to say hi to our viewers.
Hey, it's great to see you all, and thank you so much for having me on this panel.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we're extremely honored to have you here. This will be an amazing discussion. So, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Leading our discussion here today will be our host, Olivia.
Hello, everyone. With 2020 having coming to a close, so too did the great drought of superhero content that we've all been waiting for. A few weeks ago, on Disney Investor Day, Marvel Studios made its grand return, announcing a slate of new movies and shows to air in the coming year. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of those announcements in a few moments, but I'd like to start off the panel just by asking everybody, what was your first exposure to superhero or comic book media, and did you have a favorite superhero as a child? So, Professor Carnes, if you'd like to start.
Sure, mine goes all the way back to the exciting early 1990s. My babysitter, Tom Angelo, introduced me to Marvel trading cards. And so that was actually my first contact with Marvel, were these wonderful little cards you could buy at the gas station that had, they were like, basketball cards or baseball cards, only they featured the character art on the front and then a little biography of the character on the back. And from there, it was TV shows and then movies, and I kind of grew up with it.
When I was in kindergarten, my mom brought me this Spider-Man action figure. It was this huge figure. I think it was 12-inch from the Toy Biz era, based on a Spider-Man 2 movie from Sam Raimi. And it was a Spider-Man where you can make him kick, make him punch. I used to think that Spider-Man was a villain just because of how angry he looked with the mask. I didn't understand anything Marvel back then. I just thought he was a really cool looking character. But when I role played him with other characters, I always considered him the bad guy. So everybody had to stop evil Spider-Man from taking over the world. But as I watched more and more Marvel movies, the first MCU movie I've seen in theaters was Iron Man 2. And I immediately got drawn in with the lore of Marvel. And then with the Avengers and later movies, I understood more and more of the comic books. Fortunately, now I no longer view Spider-Man as a villain, where J. Jonah Jameson would probably hire me for the Daily Bugle. But I am such a huge fan of Marvel here. And I'm so grateful that Marvel has brought me to so many great friends and mentors, like all of you, as well as Professor Carnes.
I would say my first experience with superheroes was probably the like you mentioned, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire. And I don't remember when I first watched those movies, but I think just like the fact that Tobey Maguire plays it like a little more nerdy, and like those movies he's a kind of like an outcast in school and stuff, and like he kind of finds his own like value in himself and like kind of grows into his own character. I think that really inspired me, and that has like I've had a soft spot for that type of Spider-Man, I think, since a child.
My first experience with any superhero media was DC. I know, blasphemy. I'm sorry. And so I grew up watching the animated Justice League series. And so I grew up watching all of those. My brother and I actually got all the action figures and we'd play with those constantly. And then I also was a huge fan of the Christopher Reeves Superman series. As cheesy as they were some of my favorites. So I love that. But my first experience with Marvel was actually, I think it was Captain America. And I loved Captain America growing up because I thought he was such a cool character because he actually earned his superpowers. And it wasn't just like he was born with it, which was a problem I had with DC characters growing up. Because like Superman, all of those characters, they were kind of just born with these powers. But Captain America, like he earned everything that he got in life because he was such a virtuous person. And so I love that. And that's kind of what drew me into Marvel and what got me on this journey.
Yeah, don't worry about the DC plug, Kate. I mean, as much as we love Marvel, I think I love DC too. I think my first exposure to superheroes was a comic book that my dad had growing up. He had this huge like compilation Thor comic book that I used to see him read all the time. So he introduced me to Marvel comics, and from there I fell in love with all the X-Men animated series, the Batman animated series, all of that. So I grew up with the cartoons, and then I think once I saw Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, I became obsessed with Spider-Man. I had a Spider-Man birthday party in the first grade, so Spider-Man really became my favorite after a while. But yeah, I think I pretty much owe most of my introduction into the superhero genre to my dad. So moving on, the next question would be, why do you guys think that hero villain stories are so powerful?
Well, so I just want to react quickly to just how remarkable it is that like hero building, MCU stories or hero stories are powerful at all to your generation. Because when I was growing up, there weren't mainstream superhero like Marvel films. I mean, they existed, but they really, they weren't anything like what we have today, where they're cutting edge. The production values are really great. The storytelling is remarkable. And when I was growing up, Marvel was really, really niche. I mean, it was not widespread. It was not, you wouldn't see, I mean, nowadays you go out and if you go in public, when we go in public again, you'll always see a kid wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt or a Spider-Man backpack. And that is such a huge change from when I was growing up. And this was really a small community. I think that speaks to how much Marvel, hero stories always resonate with people, but Marvel hero stories and MCU stories are really touching a nerve right now, politically, socially, as inspiration for people. And so I just wanted to kick off the discussion of this by just pointing out like what a monumental change there is in popular media that now Marvel characters are among the most recognized characters on the planet. So it's doing something. Marvel stories are really resonating with people. These heroes and villains mean a lot to people. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to go to any city in the country and find Spider-Man on a backpack or a lunchbox.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Professor Carnes has said. I think no matter what hero or villain story it is, whether that's Marvel or Transformers or DC or G.I. Joe or foreign stories like the Monkey King, I think one thing is really important. There's a common theme that they resonate with us, that we all find a part of ourselves represented in these characters. I think it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that a lot of my virtues as a person, I think I've learned from these hero stories. They taught me what was right. They taught me what was wrong. They taught me to be an honest person, and empathetic person, a kind person. That's what superheroes and heroes have taught us. And the fascinating thing about them is that although they could happen in different planets, alien planets, they could happen in all kinds of fantasized settings with all these characters with these amazing powers. On the very center is very human stories about these struggles that we all have as humans. I totally agree with Professor Carnes that the recent increase of diversity in Marvel movies means so much. I was one of the people who really felt the happiness when we finally saw Black Panther on the big screen. Finally, a minority character being in the spotlight. I couldn't be more excited for the Shang-Chi movie. I've wanted to see an Asian superhero on the big screen for so long. And finally, that dream is just coming true. And every day I just couldn't believe that it's happening. And also just I think most importantly, like these stories are ageless, that they teach us lessons. They still teach us lessons even to this day. I watch Spider-Man 2 every single year, as well as The Dark Knight. I know one of them is DC and the other one is Marvel. But I think every single year they teach me a new lesson. I take new things out of that movie and they get me through difficult times. So these are just ageless and I'll carry them on with me forever.
Yeah, I think what Harry said was very important because, like, even though they're sometimes like science fiction or fantastical, these stories are essentially human stories about people conquering obstacles against all odds and defeating things that are plaguing the world, or some underdog like rising up to a challenge. And I think any movie that kind of does that well and does that sincerely can grab any audience. And I think, yeah, I think that's why these movies are resonating with so many people. And now like Professor Carnes said, it's so great that what was once like, only like considered nerdy and like super geeky to be into comic book stuff, now I'm glad it's more mainstream.
I think too, what's especially compelling about Marvel is a lot of times superhero movies, at least growing up, like there was always like the right and the wrong in superhero movies, which I think is extremely important, an extremely important characteristic about superhero movies. But what's super compelling about Marvel is they kind of delve more into the gray area between right and wrong. Especially I saw that with like um Thanos as a character. Like I definitely felt like he was more kind of in that gray area, because when he's talking about like his plan, obviously it's evil and everyone can like agree on that, but the reasoning behind it is more like, is he right? And so I think that was one thing I found super compelling about Marvel, especially like this newest iteration of Marvel. But then also I think looking at the superheroes themselves, especially with like um Captain America Civil War and those kinds of movies where it's looking at like the impacts of being a superhero in the world and like the consequences of that, and whether or not we can see superheroes as villains sometimes. And so I thought like that in itself was extremely compelling about Marvel's storytelling, is the fact that it wasn't just like breaking it down into black and white. There was definitely a gray area and kind of evaluating that.
I couldn't agree more. I think a lot of the times people have it set in their heads that with superhero stories, you have to have this binary like perspective. And I don't think that's true at all. And honestly, I think growing up, most of the exposure people got to superhero stories was through something like cartoons or animated series. And as an artist, I love cartoons, I love drawings, and I love comic books. But I think people tend to condescend to media when it's in an animated format, unfortunately. And I think the reason that the MCU has captured the attention of so many is I think putting the production value that they can into it and making it a live action format has sort of removed that inherent barrier that people have towards superhero stories, where it's something that they say, oh, it's just for kids, it's not something to be taken seriously. So I think that's something that we owe to Marvel, and I'm super grateful for that. Moving on to topic 2, our topic 2 is called Superheroes at Duke. So the first question would be, how have you brought your Marvel love to the Duke community?
So this is a really interesting question. I've kind of done it two ways myself. First, I brought a lot of Marvel content into my classes that aren't related to, comics or popular culture or media or entertainment or anything like that. Sometimes in subtle ways. So often in my classes, if I need just sort of a generic image, let's say I'm making lecture slides and I just need an image of something, I might take an image from Marvel. And they're often images that people won't even recognize as Marvel. It's just sort of for my own enjoyment, or to maybe connect to the one student in the class who is a fan as well. So like around Halloween, I had a picture of a vampire on a slide, and I used Morbius, the living vampire. And I don't know whether any students caught that reference, but it's just, I think it illustrates kind of a principle of work that I think is really important, which is whatever job you have, you sort of have to enjoy it. You have to find ways to put little pieces of yourself into it. And so that's one way that I brought Marvel into the classroom. Or like I was teaching a lesson on the 4 villains of decision making, and it was not too long after Thor Ragnarok had come out. And so I just related them to the sort of 4 main antagonists in Thor Ragnarok. And I actually think a lot of students caught that reference. Like I think, many students had seen the film, and it actually did say, oh, okay, yeah, Hela is kind of like overconfidence, and so it helps students kind of grasp something. But because I don't teach on entertainment, I don't teach on media, I don't get a lot of chances to teach about Marvel. But the other way I brought sort of my interest in Marvel and to Duke is I'm actually doing research on the way politics is depicted in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I'm a political scientist. And Harry knows this because he's been on my research team and is actually a contributor to an edited volume I'm co-editing about the way politics and society are depicted in MCU films. And so I've tried to take something I'm passionate about sort of outside of my research and bring it in and use the tools of a political scientist to think about the MCU, because going back to our first discussion, these films really resonate with people. I mean, more people will see MCU films than we'll see probably political science lectures in a typical year. So this volume and this research project is about understanding like, what do these films teach people about politics and society? Are these lessons good or bad? And so that's kind of the other big way that I've tried to bring my love of Marvel into the work I do for Duke University.
I was definitely one of those students who got Professor Carnes' references in the class. I remember the first day in class, Professor Carnes started making Marvel references of Iron Man. And then I told my friends, I was like, this is the best professor I've ever had. There's no one else who's gonna be better. And then Professor Carnes just makes these awesome Marvel references in class, but it's also meaningful references that made me see how Marvel is deeply related to the real world. Kind of like I said, these are deeply rooted human stories. And I remember in our final, Professor Carnes made some references to AIM and 10 Rings. And I don't think anyone else got it. And it felt so nice later on telling people, like, did you know that was actually a Marvel reference? People were like, no, I didn't know that. And I felt like the smartest person in the room. And yes, I was part of Professor Carnes' research team researching about politics and Marvel. And that research opportunity really allowed me to open my eyes and see how, like I said, how Marvel can be so fundamental to our decision making, even our policies, like having these actual real world impact on policies and our politics. And I think it's a really, really meaningful and interesting perspective that we did the research on. My friend and I, who also did the research for Professor Carnes, we were writing our own volume about how Marvel villains are actually representing real societal issues, kind of looking at them, like Cate said, no longer from that black and white angle, but rather a more complex angle. And yes, outside of 155, I also bring my Marvel love to classes. I make references, sometimes way too much. Fortunately, no professor has found that annoying. I think they appreciate having a little more lighthearted references in class. And I've brought my Marvel love to this organization by hosting this episode. And I keep trying to create this culture of Marvel love to my friends, telling them to watch the Infinity Saga and everything. So yeah, I am the Marvel spokesperson, at least student-wise, in this school.
Yeah, I think using your personal love of something is a great way to just like make friends in general. I know I have tens of thousands of Marvel t-shirts that I purposely wear at different places just to see like who notices and stuff. It's like a fun little game that I play, but I think it's awesome to be able to share what you love with people. I think that's what really makes the connections that you make in school worthwhile. So I mean, even when you're in class, making small references to things that are a part of your life can really enrich the experience for everybody, especially when you're in classes that have, not that many students. You can get a more intimate experience.
Yeah, I think like I'm not a huge Marvel person, or I don't know as much as probably you guys do, but I think just a way of bringing it to Duke is just like, watching some Marvel movies with friends on like a Friday night or something, and just when you first come to Duke, you don't really know anyone, and if watching like a movie that everyone can enjoy is kind of a way to bond. And then I think Infinity War came out while I was in my freshman year, so we all went. Me and some friends went to the theater and saw that, and that was kind of like my first like theater experience in Durham. So that was really cool, and that was another way that Marvel impacted my life at Duke.
Definitely have to agree with both Olivia and Viraaj. I think that just having Marvel be this bonding experience between friends is really powerful. I think some of my closest friends are the ones that I go and see Marvel movies with, or like opening night, we are there like midnight watching that film. And I think those are some of my most cherished memories. And also just some of the really, yeah, great bonding experiences with my friends. I also think like just having these Marvel release dates to look forward to, especially right now, is very important. Just because I know for me, like I'm a huge traveler, and so the fact that I can't really look forward to traveling right now is really hard for me. But the fact that I have Marvel release dates to look forward to has definitely been a blessing during this difficult time.
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about this on the podcast about how the future of movie theaters after COVID and how it's sort of impacting the viewer's experience versus streaming. But I remember when Infinity War and Endgame came out, going to see that in the theater, and I think honestly that's one of the most different theater experiences I've had. I know when we talk about theater experience, we're usually sort of drift to talking about like film auteurs like Christopher Nolan or Paul Thomas Anderson and the sort of different type of cinema. But I think comic book films really touch that special experience that a filmmaker wants you to have when you're in the theater.
I totally agree with that. I think I make a point to go to theaters to watch superhero films. I think there's nothing quite like it, just because that experience is just really something. And I remember back when I saw Captain America Civil War, I still remember this because I went and saw it on the big screen, but I saw it with my entire grade. So they rented out the movie theater just for all of us to go watch Captain America Civil War. And unfortunately, I was in the second row, which I never sit that close because let's just say my neck hurt after that. But I still remember it because it was definitely like this crazy experience. So
Yeah, it's been more than 1 year since Endgame came out. But the feeling of anticipating for that movie and actually watching that movie, it still felt like yesterday. Like the experience doesn't start and end in the theaters. It extends when you're anticipating for the movie, you're speculating about what happens in the movies, which is what we're doing right now, until after the movie, and you're still discussing the movie. I just remember when I first started watching Endgame, like when the movie started, I was just like, this is it. This is it, folks. And I was so excited. And then when Cap lifted Mjolnir, I think I mentioned this in a 155 class. I was just like in front of all these students. I was saying to Professor Carnes, like, that was the best moment of my life. And I couldn't believe what was in front of my eyes. And just obviously when Iron Man died, like my heart sunk like everyone else. I mean, I cried like for days after the movie because you felt like you lost a friend who was there with you since the start and who taught you so much, and now he's gone, and you personally feel that. I'm getting a little emotional just talking about it right now, and I think that's the power of these Marvel movies. So I think this theatrical experience, I think, is never going to die, and I'm so glad that Marvel was committing to the theatrical model. When we thought that Black Widow was going to be on Disney Plus, Marvel was committing to the theatrical model, and I have nothing but respect for that.
I think too, you bring up a really important point about Marvel characters and the fact that like Iron Man, obviously he's a fictional character, but we all felt this deep connection to him. And I think that's the beauty of Marvel, is the fact that they take these characters who obviously probably will never exist in this world, but they make them feel real and make them feel human and all of that. And so I think that's definitely one thing I really value about Marvel, is just their character development and building.
I know Endgame and Infinity War were specifically, everyone thinks of them when they think of anticipation, but just in case that's not your answer for this question, I was wondering if you guys had a favorite MCU film that you were anticipating the most, like before it came out.
For me, it was Endgame. I did a full, I think it was like 30 or 40 days off social media so that I wouldn't get any spoilers. So basically, once the film first leaked or was shown anywhere, I think it was actually a Saudi movie theater somehow had a copy of it. And as soon as that news broke, I just went off social media completely. Facebook, Twitter. I was in a Marvel group and I said, I'm definitely out because I don't want any spoilers, because I so wanted to be surprised. I didn't look at any speculation. So for me, that was the big anticipated film. In preparation, I also rewatched all the MCU films in order with no skips and no doubles. And to do that, I had to watch everything up to Captain Marvel, on streaming, then watch Captain Marvel in theaters, then do nothing else, watch no other MCU films until Endgame so that I could get the complete run in order. So that was my most anticipated film. That was the most work I did. And it paid off. I mean, the film is just a colossally successful exercise in fan service. It's immensely rewarding to watch these films and then to see how deftly Endgame weaves the characters, the plots, the references together and produces this final product that just works on so many levels. I mean, it works. I saw it multiple times. I saw it with people who it was their first Marvel film. I saw it with, diehard fan. And it works for everybody. And so that was, by far my most anticipated film. And just the one that I put the most effort into really giving the filmmakers, giving Marvel Studios a shot to do their very best work, giving them a fair chance by taking the artistic product really seriously. So that was my most anticipated. I love them all, but that was the one I really worked to enjoy it.
I have to go with Endgame too. I think Endgame is one of the only films where I was even a little anxious before I saw it, because I don't think I was emotionally ready for the movie. I was excited as the release date got shorter and shorter, but I got more and more anxious because I was like, am I gonna be ready for this? And then I remember the day we saw Endgame. That was like the first day after finals on April 26, 2019. And I decided to stay a day later just to see it with my friends. And I remember just waiting for my friend's car to arrive in the Jarvis common room. And I was sitting there, and it was almost the exact same feeling as me sitting in the backstage of the Kennedy Center right before I did that big piano performance. It was that level of excitement and anxiousness at the exact same time, like going to like almost one of the most important events in your life. And I really hope that we can see something like that again in theaters. I would love to, I would do anything to get that feeling of watching Endgame for the first time again.
Yeah, I also have to agree. I think Endgame definitely was my most anticipated film. Although unfortunately for me, I had avoided spoilers up until the very moment I set foot in the theater. And then I was on my phone, and for some reason, I don't know why, I had my AirDrop turned on, and someone walked out of the theater as I was waiting in line to go in and AirDropped me the spoiler about Iron Man. So that was definitely such a great moment for me. Yeah. Um, I might have had a little freak out in the lobby there. But my friends, I didn't spoil it for them. I just was hoping it was not true. But anyway, that was my fun Endgame moment.
Yeah, I think as much as I would like to say a different movie, I think it's mine's also Endgame, because like after coming out of Infinity War, I was like, how are they going to, like, what can they do next that can like solve this issue? Like I had seen, I think, Ant-Man 2, Ant-Man and the Wasp, where they have like the quantum realm, and I was like, and people had told me that that is probably what they're going to explore in Infinity War or in Endgame, but I was still like, I don't know. I was just so excited to see what they will come up with to solve the whole big issue.
So before I say this, let me just say first off, I love Endgame. I think it's amazing. But honestly, my most anticipated movie in the MCU is probably Captain America Civil War. Mostly because I'm a comic book fan and I knew going into Civil War in the comic book version, Captain America dies. And I knew they were building up to Endgame, so I was sort of doubting whether they'd have to have like the courage just like straight off kill a main character before the big crossover event. But I was still seriously anxious about it. And I remember Civil War came out May 6th, 2016, I believe. And that's the same month as AP exams. So I was already racked with nervousness. So all my emotions were like hyped up times 11. So that was probably my most anticipated film.
I definitely feel with the Captain America dying thing, because every single Marvel movie since Civil War, I was ready for Cap to die. Like Civil War, I was ready for him to die. I was like, I gotta get my tissues, and he didn't die. And in Infinity War, when Thanos punched him in Wakanda, I thought he died right there. Like he was just not moving, and I thought Cap died. I was like, I'm not emotionally ready for this, but he survived. And in Endgame, that part where Thanos smashed his shield exactly like he did in the Infinity Gauntlet comics, I thought Cap was going to stand up and say the comic quote, like, as long as one man stand before you, Thanos, like, you're not going to destroy Earth. And I thought he wasn't going to die right there. And then he managed to survive. He managed to have the best life that he could get. And I got slapped on the face because I was telling everybody, I was like, just watch, Captain America is going to die in Endgame because this whole story arc is about sacrifice. And I was so wrong. I think for these last few minutes here, I'd like to do a bit of a Q&A with Professor Carnes, or if anyone has any questions regarding what Professor Carnes is currently doing with Marvel and the research, or anything regarding Public Policy 155, this will be a really good chance to ask any questions you want.
Sure. My first question, I guess. Regarding the paper that you guys are working on, I was wondering if there's any specific Marvel movie that you think is like most rife with material for how viewing how Marvel portrays politics.
You know, I think, I guess one good example might be Thor. And really here I'm thinking of Agent Coulson. So Agent Coulson is sort of emblematic in Thor of the way the MCU depicts politics and government more generally. And I want to just bracket for a second the question of whether SHIELD represents the US government or sort of multinational government, because that's a complicated question even within the MCU. But if you'll just accept for a minute that, Coulson, I think on the screen to people kind of, I think most viewers think of him as government. He's the guy who shows up, he's in a suit, he represents an agency with an acronym. And if you watch that film again, Coulson is often an antagonist. He's often in the hero's way, but he's not the main antagonist. He's not, the villain really sort of driving the negative action in the story. He's not truly the thing to be overcome. When the MCU depicts government negatively, it's often like that. It's something that's in the way, that doesn't quite understand, that the heroes need to sort of bring around. But then if you look at Coulson again and say Avengers, he is 100% supporting the heroes, trying to help them accomplish a shared goal. It's, government working with people to try to solve big problems. To the point that Coulson even apparently at first sacrifices his life, although we know later that's not what happened. And so I think Coulson is sort of the kind of punchline. I went into this research project thinking, I wonder how the MCU collectively depicts government. We can pull out examples of, government not being, super helpful, being in the way, being inept from the MCU. We can pull out examples of government helping. I wanted to see on balance, what do the movies look like? And so I recruited Harry and Christina Zhang to help us, to help me. What we did is we actually recorded every scene in all the films where a representative of the US government is on the screen. And then Harry and Christina coded whether it was a positive or negative depiction. And then we kind of reconciled our codings. And we got help from Preston Massey, another sort of a high school research assistant who was a more casual fan of the films, to get sort of a third perspective. And that's really important because these films are, incredibly widely viewed. They are, right now, I think 3 of the 10 highest grossing films of all time are MCU films, are Marvel Studios movies. And so I really wanted to know, okay, on balance, how is government depicted? And I really was prepared to find negative, because if you think about the superhero genre, by definition, it's about problems that can't be solved by regular people. It needs, it needs super powered individuals. These are threats that need to be solved by super powered individuals. And one of the big critiques of comics in general is that they, depict problems, or they depict government as not able to solve problems, because if government could solve the problem, what would be the point of the heroes? And we didn't find that. I mean, when we actually looked at all the scenes in the MCU, we found this mix, this Coulson style mix of positive, negative, kind of neutral depictions of government. And so, Olivia, sorry for the kind of long answer to your question, but yeah, if you want to understand the way the MCU engages with government, I think Phil Coulson is across the MCU films is kind of your go-to character.
In your research, did you guys look a lot at Captain America Civil War? Because I mean, in my recent memory, I think that's one I know that kind of deals with the question of regulation or not, and whether the government should step in to kind of rise above these superheroes and control their power.
We didn't really zoom in on that in particular. This was sort of a big, almost accounting exercise to look at the whole MCU collectively. One of the papers in the edited volume by a scholar of civil military relations named Steve Seidemann. Seidemann's contribution to this big edited volume is a paper thinking about the question, which is one of the defining questions in the civil military relations literature, of who guards the guardians? Who polices the police, right? And that's a central question in Captain America Civil War. But also, it sneaks into other MCU films, and people, you see this even before Civil War and Sokovia, in the tension between the World Security Council and S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers, where you have these different layers. And so Seidemann walks through in this really nice chapter in the edited volume, the way that MCU films embody, or sort of, I think, mirror or illuminate the very real tension of, how do civilians control superpowered individuals, whether that's, Tony Stark or the actual real world US military. And that's a very thorny question in the political science literature, in the Civ Mil literature. And Civil War is just a brilliant discussion of it. I mean, Sokovia is a really nice illustration of one way to tackle that problem. And Cap's perspective is a really nice illustration of the other side, the professionalization side. Let the powerful decide how to wield their power. Give them a task and then stay out of their way. So I don't personally have a lot in my paper, and Harry and Christina don't in their separate paper. I should mention they have a fully separate paper in this edited volume on villains in the MCU. We don't dive into Civil War in particular, but if you're interested in that, there's a whole chapter that's just for you.
Forgive me if this doesn't shake out into a question, but when you said who guards the Guardians, naturally it made me think about a different comic book property, Watchmen, even though that's a DC property, but who watches the Watchmen? And it's interesting to me that the whole primary conceit of Watchmen hinges on the depiction of the government as an accomplice to a supervillain in order to lie to the American public and ultimately save the world from the Cold War's nuclear arms race. So when you sort of contrast that against the depiction of government in MCU, it's interesting to me, like the different way in which it's depicted. So you have something that's the whole primary conceit of Civil War is, of course, pitting the whole World Security Council against superheroes, but it says it still maintains that the government is in a position of wanting to help people. It doesn't sort of shift into this sort of dystopia that Watchmen does. So I think that's sort of a different tact that DC takes versus Marvel.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, that phrase always reminds me of Watchmen too. And one of the first, complete runs of any comic I read was actually Watchmen. Even though I'm, a Marvel partisan, I don't dislike DC, and I can appreciate the really great art and literature that comes out of the DC side. So I don't mind the reference at all, Olivia. But I think it's really telling that, yeah, that was almost one of my expectations was, would we see, if we looked across the MCU, would we see kind of these, more insidious portrayals of government? Because government's a really easy foil. It's really easy for people, and you see this in the real world too. It's really easy for people to say, the big bad government is doing this. And in, storytelling, it's an easy conceit to sort of use in your writing. My guess is if we did the same exercise with the actual comics that inspired a lot of these stories, you would probably see something similar on the Marvel side. You'd probably see a mix, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but not overwhelmingly negative the way, portrayals like the sort of government partnering with the villains in Watchmen. You probably wouldn't see on balance more negative. That might partly reflect the fact that, Marvel abided by the comics code for so long, and it used to be against the comics code to depict government and police negatively at all, which is just wild in and of itself, I think, thinking about it from a modern perspective. But my guess is, these are stories that couldn't for a long time and then didn't after that really go after government, really set the government up as a straw man or an easy bad guy. And so you do see this kind of complicated relationship. And I bet if we were to do a similar exercise using like some of the big comic runs, Olivia, I bet we'd find the same thing. And maybe you should. There's an easy senior thesis right there. Depictions of government and, canonical Marvel comics.
Thank you so much, Professor Carnes, for joining us today. And thank you so much for such a deep and thought-provoking conversation. I hope that our viewers can take a lot from this conversation, just like we did, and learn a bit more about Marvel and especially how it connects to the real world. And Professor Carnes currently teaches Public Policy 155 in the fall semester. So if you're interested in Marvel or you're interested in some public policy, take that class. As a 155 alum, I can tell you it's one of the best classes at Duke, and it's definitely worth your time and so much more. So thank you so much again, Professor Carnes, and we wish that you could join us again in the future.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'm so glad to meet some more Marvel fans at Duke. Harry, you were like the first proper Marvel fan I met at Duke, in part because that was the year I started really sneaking content into class. Harry came to class in I think the first shirt was a Thor shirt. Yeah, it was Thor and Loki. And I was like, oh, okay, there's a Marvel fan in my class. That's great. And then I used James Hallett as the name of like a fictional state legislator in one of my assignments. And I literally thought no one would catch the reference. And then Harry just came like running down the stairs and he was like, Professor Carnes, we're writing this memo to Wolverine. And I was like, oh no, the secret's out. But I was so happy to connect with Harry and, because I learned that I got to meet some students who are interested in Marvel as well. And I'm so glad to meet the other three of you here or get to know more about your interest in Marvel. So So yeah, I hope you'll all keep in touch. I hope you'll let me know when there's chances to do more of this stuff, Harry. And if you all need a local comic shop, I'll just put in a plug. I love my local shop. It's Ultimate Comics. They just opened a new store on 15501. Once the pandemic's over, I'm going to go there in person. And they also have a live show on Facebook that I'm usually at. So tonight at 7, if you want to buy some comics online, send me an email.
That is awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I
no,
actually need a local comic shop.
oh yeah, so Olivia, if you're not from here and you need a really good shop, this is like there are a couple of good ones, but this is like the big one in the Research Triangle, and the owner's super nice, and they're like really good people. So, yeah. Well, Harry, thanks again for including me. It's really good to meet and talk to all of you. So yeah, keep in touch.